There is something uniquely deceptive about living in a community governed by an HOA. At first glance, it all appears so polished, so carefully maintained, so picture perfect that newcomers are often fooled into thinking they've discovered paradise. Perfectly trimmed hedges, driveways without a crack in sight, lakefront views that shimmer like glass, an illusion of order. But beneath that polished surface often lies something far darker. Power games, favoritism, corruption, and individuals who confuse the rules with their personal playground. And in my case, that individual was a woman everyone in the neighborhood referred to simply as a Karen. Karen wasn't just any neighbor. She was the reigning queen of the HOA board. Every decision, no matter how minor, passed through her. She thrived on control and adored the feeling of power she held over her neighbors' lives. She was the type to measure grass with a ruler, file complaints about mailboxes she deemed too dull, and hand out fines like candy. For years, I kept my head down and avoided her radar, knowing that life was easier when she didn't notice you. But that peace shattered the moment she discovered my property, specifically the lake on my ranch that bordered the HOA jurisdiction. It wasn't just any lake. It was the largest body of water in the area, a peaceful stretch where my family had fished, swum, and built countless memories. It was outside the HOA control, privately owned by me, and part of the land deed that had been in my family for generations. And yet to Karen, boundaries meant nothing. She saw it, wanted it, and decided she would take it. It began subtly at first. Neighbors I hardly knew started showing up at the edge of my land, setting up chairs and picnics like they belonged there. Kids splashed in the water, their laughter carrying across the property. When I confronted them, most looked genuinely surprised, insisting they had been told by the HOA that the lake was now a shared community amenity. I laughed it off, assuming it was a misunderstanding. But the trickle of uninvited guests grew into a flood. Every weekend, strangers filled the space, leaving behind trash, breaking fences, even dragging in kayaks. Then came the turning point. One Saturday morning, I woke up to the sound of hammering. Curious and increasingly concerned, I followed the noise down to the lake. What I found nearly made my blood boil. Karen's son, a smug 20-something with a history of entitlement, was standing on my property, building what looked like a private dock. He grinned like he owned the place, pointing proudly at his handiwork while a group of his friends lounged nearby, treating the ranch like their personal playground. When I confronted him, he scoffed and waved me off. He said his mother had gifted him the lakefront as if it were hers to give. Forgive. The audacity was breathtaking. A lifetime of ownership, family history, and blood, sweat, and tears tied to that ranch, and Karen had casually handed it off to her spoiled son like a birthday present. Naturally, I stormed straight to Karen's house to demand answers. What I found there was even worse. She sat smugly on her porch, sipping iced tea as though she had orchestrated the whole thing perfectly. She explained, with that condescending smile she reserved for people she believed were beneath her, that the lake had been reclassified as part of the HOA amenities, things part of the area amenity. According to her, my ownership didn't matter because the board had voted to incorporate the lake into the community. It was, in her words, a better for everyone. And her son, of course, would be the first to benefit. I reminded her that private property couldn't simply be voted away by a handful of neighbors, that deeds and legal records outweighed her so-called reclassification. But Karen wasn't interested in reason. She had power, she had control, and she believed that made her untouchable. Things escalated quickly from there. The very next day, when I went to remove Karen's son and his friends from my land, Karen called the cops. She stood there, smug as ever, waving her HOA papers as though they were a badge of law. The officers arrived, listened to both sides, and seemed confused. On one hand, there were property records with my name on them. On the other, a determined HOA president insisting she had authority over the land. For a brief moment, I wondered if Karen would get away with it. She had the confidence of someone used to winning, someone who had manipulated the system for years. But the officers eventually sided with me, warning Karen's son to leave before he was charged with trespassing. Karen's face twisted in fury, her smug expression cracking under the weight of humiliation. She had lost the battle, but I could see in her eyes she wasn't finished. And she was right. What followed wasn't just petty harassment. It was war. Karen began targeting me with every trick in the HOA book. She sent me fines for unapproved landscaping, accused me of keeping unauthorized livestock, and even claimed my truck violated the community's aesthetic standards. She rallied neighbors against me, painting me as selfish, unwilling to share community resources. But what Karen didn't know was that she had made a fatal mistake. In her obsession with control, she had overlooked a critical detail, one I had quietly discovered months earlier when I joined the Frete Change the Chidkeeper. On paper, Karen may have held the title of president, but when it came to the finances, I was the one holding the reins. Every dollar, every project, every amenity flowed through budgets I now had authority to approve or deny. Karen had declared war on me, but she had no idea she was waging it against the very person who controlled the lifeblood of her HOA kingdom: the money. When Karen lost her first attempt to steal the lake, her pride took a devastating blow. For someone like her, humiliation was worse than defeat. She had spent years molding herself into the face of authority, the figure neighbors feared, respected, or at the very least tolerated. To have her authority challenged, and worse, dismissed by the police in front of her own son, ignited a fury that would not be easily extinguished. From that day forward, I became her personal target. It was as though she had declared open season on my life, weaponizing every HOA rule, loophole, and complaint form against me. Within a week, I received 3 separate violation notices. The first accused me of keeping unauthorized vehicles on my property, citing my old ranch truck parked beside the barn. The second claimed my fencing was unsightly and demanded immediate replacement with board-approved materials. The third alleged that my horses were disturbing the peace and needed to be relocated. Each notice came stamped with fines, hundreds of dollars for so-called violations that had never been enforced against anyone else. Neighbors with boats in their driveways, rusting trailers, and even collapsing fences had never faced this kind of scrutiny. But Karen wasn't applying the rules evenly. She was wielding them like weapons, carving out exceptions for her allies and sharpening them against her enemies. And I, at the top of her list, was enemy number 1. I could have ignored the notices, tossed them in the trash like the baseless threats they were. But Karen was clever. She didn't just rely on fines. She leaned on her influence with neighbors, weaving lies and half-truths to paint me as a menace. Suddenly, people who had once waved at me across the street turned away. I noticed whispers when I walked into the community store, sidelong glances when I stopped at the post office. Karen's smear campaign was working. And then came her boldest move yet. One Friday evening, I returned home to find construction equipment parked near the lake. Fresh stakes marked the ground, string lines crisscrossing what was unmistakably the beginning of a large-scale project. At first, I thought it was another stunt by Karen's son. But when I investigated further, I discovered blueprints tacked one of the stakes. They showed plans for a community recreation area, picnic tables, boat ramps, and a playground all centered around my privately owned lake. Karen wasn't just encouraging trespassing anymore. She was laying claim to the land outright, funneling HOA funds into a project she had no right to start. And in doing so, she exposed herself without realizing it. Because I was on the budget committee, every expenditure, every invoice, every proposal eventually had to pass through me. And while Karen had pushed the project forward under the guise of a community enrichment, the funding had been left pending, waiting for final approval. That was the moment I knew the scales of power were tipping. Karen might have the loudest voice, but I controlled the purse strings, and without money, her grand plans crumbled to dust. Still, I wasn't ready to strike just yet. Timing was everything. For now, I let her think she was winning. She boasted to neighbors about the upcoming recreation area, rallying support with promises of barbecues by the water and family-friendly gatherings. She even scheduled a ribbon-cutting ceremony for the following month, plastering the community bulletin board with glossy posters. Behind the scenes, however, I started pulling threads. I quietly froze the funding allocations she had earmarked for the lake project, rerouting them into other maintenance categories. Street repairs, landscaping contracts, drainage work, mundane necessities that didn't draw attention but ate up the very funds Karen had planned to misuse. To anyone looking at the spreadsheets, everything appeared routine. To Karen, who never bothered with financial details, nothing seemed amiss. But little by little, the money for her precious project evaporated. Meanwhile, I documented everything. Every trespasser, every construction attempt, every violation of property rights. I recorded it all. Photographs, receipts, and correspondence piled up in my files. Karen thought she was cornering me, but in reality, she was building the very case I would use to dismantle her reign. Still, her harassment grew bolder. At one point, she ordered security patrols, private contractors hired with HOA funds, to monitor the lakefront area. These guards marched along my property line, pretending to enforce rules that didn't apply to them. I confronted one of them, asking under whose authority he was acting. His response? The HOA president. Karen had convinced them the lake was public property. They were shocked when I presented my deed and threatened legal action. They withdrew the very next day, embarrassed to have been caught in the middle of her scheme. The cracks in Karen's empire were beginning to show. Neighbors who had once been dazzled by her promises now questioned why the project wasn't progressing. The ribbon-cutting ceremony loomed closer, but the site remained nothing more than half-driven stakes and abandoned string lines. Rumors started circulating, whispers that the HOA funds were being mismanaged, that Karen's leadership wasn't as flawless as it appeared. I stayed silent, watching it all unfold. I didn't need to fan the flames. Karen was doing it herself. Every overreach, every misuse of funds, every lie chipped away at her credibility, and I knew it was only a matter of time before the hammer fell. The day it did would not only expose Karen's corruption, but also remind her of the one truth she had forgotten. Power in an HOA isn't about who yells the loudest. It's about who controls the budget. And I controlled everything. The battle lines were drawn. Karen thought she was preparing for a grand victory celebration at her ribbon-cutting ceremony. But what she didn't realize was that I had already laid the groundwork to turn that day into her public downfall. The morning of the so-called ribbon-cutting ceremony arrived with a sense of forced celebration. Flyers had gone out weeks earlier, plastered across mailboxes and community boards. Karen had promised an unveiling of the new community recreation area at the lake. And though the site itself looked nothing like her glossy advertisements, the neighbors still gathered in anticipation. For many, it was the first major project the HOA had attempted in years, and people were eager for a chance to mingle, eat free snacks, and imagine their summer afternoons by the water. Karen played her role to perfection. She had decorated the site with balloons and banners, setting up folding chairs in neat rows. A small podium stood near the water's edge, adorned with flowers, as though it were the stage for a political rally. And of course, her son stood proudly beside the unfinished dock, as though he already owned it. Karen moved through the crowd with the air of a queen greeting her subjects, shaking hands and smiling for photographs. But beneath the surface, tension buzzed. Sharp-eyed neighbors noticed the absence of any visible progress. There were no picnic tables, no boat ramp, no playground, just a half-built dock, a few scattered stakes, and a patch of trampled grass. Questions whispered through the crowd. Where had the money gone? Why hadn't the project even broken ground? I stayed back at first, watching from a distance. It was important to let Karen have her stage, to let her dig the hole herself. I knew what was coming, and the timing had to be perfect. When the clock struck noon, Karen took the podium. She launched into her speech with confidence, her voice carrying over the lake. She spoke about community, about shared spaces, about how the HOA was finally investing in family values. Her words painted a glowing picture of a future where the lakefront was a bustling hub of joy. The crowd clapped politely, though murmurs of doubt rippled underneath. Then came the moment she had been waiting for. Her son grinned at her side, basking in reflected glory. It was supposed to be her triumph, the culmination of weeks of scheming. But as she reached for the ribbon, I stepped forward. All eyes turned as I walked to the front, holding a folder thick with documents. Karen froze, her scissors suspended midair. She tried to dismiss me with a wave, but the crowd had already shifted, sensing something was wrong. They wanted answers, and I was ready to give them. I began by holding up the property deed, the official papers showing that the lake belonged to me, not the HOA. Murmurs grew louder as I explained how Karen had misled the community, claiming ownership that was never hers. Faces in the crowd turned from curiosity to shock. Some neighbors glanced at Karen, expecting her to deny it, but she said nothing. Her lips pressed in, her face paling. Next, I opened the folder to reveal the budget records. Page after page showed how funds earmarked for the recreation project had been frozen, rerouted, or simply never approved through. I explained calmly and methodically that no money had been allocated for her grand plan because it was never legally authorized. The so-called project was nothing more than smoke and mirrors. Gasps rippled through the audience. People leaned closer, squinting at the spreadsheets and invoices I held up. Questions erupted. Where had their HOA fees actually gone? Why had Karen promised them a lakefront paradise when nothing had been budgeted? Karen tried to recover, fumbling for words. She insisted the paperwork was in process, that delays were normal, and that everything was still on track. But her voice wavered, her composure cracking as the crowd pressed her harder. Her son muttered angrily, but his bluster only made things worse. And then came the final blow. I revealed the photographs I had taken, the construction stakes on my property, the unauthorized guards she had hired, the trash left behind by trespassers. Each image painted a damning picture of trespass, misuse of funds, and abuse of power. Karen's credibility unraveled before everyone's eyes. By the time I finished, the crowd had turned. Neighbors who once supported her were now glaring, demanding explanations. Whispers of illegal and lawsuits swirled through the air. Karen's son kicked at the dirt in frustration, his earlier smugness gone. And Karen herself, usually so polished and commanding, stood frozen at the podium, her scissors dangling uselessly by her side. The ribbon remained uncut. The ceremony dissolved into chaos as people stormed away, muttering about recalling her from the board and demanding transparency. For the first time in years, Karen wasn't in control. She wasn't feared. She wasn't admired. She was exposed. But I wasn't finished, not yet. This public humiliation was only the beginning. Karen still held her position on the board, and as long as she did, she would continue to find ways to make my life miserable. I had embarrassed her, but I hadn't destroyed her power. That required something more, something permanent. Humiliation does strange things to people. For most, it teaches humility, a reminder to tread more carefully. But for Karen, humiliation was fuel. The failed ribbon-cutting ceremony had left her reputation in tatters. The neighbors who once bowed to her authority now questioned her judgment. Whispers of recall and replacement spread through the community like wildfire. And while many would have retreated, licking their wounds in silence, Karen doubled down. Within days, the retaliation began. The first strike came in the form of fines, dozens of them, stacked one after another in my mailbox. Each envelope carried the familiar HOA letterhead, stamped with accusations that bordered on absurdity. My grass was too long, despite being trimmed weekly. My driveway contained unauthorized cracks, even though the pavement was solid. One notice claimed my mailbox was out of compliance because the paint was slightly faded. The most laughable violation of all accused my barn of being a non-conforming architecture, despite the fact that it stood there decades before the HOA even existed. It was a barrage designed not to enforce rules, but to overwhelm me with paperwork, fees, and stress. Karen knew that most homeowners buckled under the weight of endless notices. They either paid up or gave in. But I wasn't most homeowners. Each fine went straight into a growing folder of evidence, proof that Karen was abusing her authority. But she didn't stop there. She mobilized her allies, neighbors she had courted with favors, petty power players eager to keep their own perks. They began a whisper campaign, spreading rumors that I was selfish, that I was trying to hog the lake for myself. According to them, I was the villain who refused to share, the man standing in the way of community progress. The lies spread fast, infecting block parties and backyard barbecues. People I barely knew avoided eye contact when I passed by, swayed by Karen's narrative. At the same time, Karen's son continued to taunt me. Late at night, I would find him loitering near the edge of the lake, blasting music or tossing beer cans into the water. Sometimes he brought friends, daring me to confront them, hoping I would snap and give Karen an excuse to call the cops again. His presence was a constant reminder that this war was personal and not just political. The pressure mounted, but while Karen believed she was tightening the noose, I was quietly tightening mine around her. As a member of the budget committee, I had access not just to current finances, but to past records as well. Late nights were spent combing through spreadsheets, invoices, and receipts. And what I found was damning. Karen's misuse of HOA funds didn't start with the lake project. It stretched back years. Landscaping contracts awarded to her friends at inflated rates. Security patrols billed for hours never worked. Even HOA social events showed inflated expenses with suspiciously vague receipts. It was a trail of corruption hiding in plain sight, overlooked because no one had bothered to scrutinize the details. I documented everything. Every shady transaction, every discrepancy, every suspicious payment. The more I dug, the clearer the picture became. Karen had been treating the HO budget as her personal piggy bank, but exposing her required patience. Timing was key. The HOA board elections were just 2 months away, and Karen was planning to run for re-election as president. She was desperate to rebuild her image, to prove she still had the community's trust. If I struck too soon, she would find a way to spin it, dismissing my evidence as a smear campaign. But if I waited until the right moment, when the community's eyes were already on her, I could ensure her downfall was complete. In the meantime, Karen escalated her harassment. She sent inspectors to my property, citing fabricated safety concerns. At one point, a notice appeared claiming my ranch needed a structural review before it could remain occupied. It was nothing more than intimidation, but it showed how far she was willing to go. Still, the cracks in her empire were widening. Neighbors who once believed her lies began questioning why the HOA budget was so opaque. Why, after years of high fees, the community still lacked promised improvements. Whispers turned into murmurs, murmurs into conversations. And I made sure those conversations were fueled with subtle nudges. Questions asked at the right moment. Hints about discrepancies in the budget. Reminders of the failed ribbon cutting. The tipping point came one evening when I received a phone call from another board member. He was one of Karen's longtime allies, a man who had always voted in her favor. But now he sounded nervous. He had been approached by several neighbors demanding answers about the budget. He confessed he was beginning to worry about his own reputation if Karen's mismanagement came to light. So, the alliance was crumbling. Karen sensed it too. Her once confident strut through the neighborhood was replaced with tighter smiles, sharper tones, and frantic efforts to rally support. She began calling emergency meetings, trying to push through last-minute projects to win back goodwill. But each project stalled for the same reason. The funds weren't there. I had made sure of that. And so, the stage was set. Karen thought she was dragging me down with endless fines, smear campaigns, and intimidation. What she didn't realize was that she had given me exactly what I needed. Time. Time to gather evidence, time to build support, time to prepare for the strike that would end her presidency once and for all. The upcoming HOA election wasn't just another vote. It was going to be Karen's reckoning. And when the community finally saw the truth, they wouldn't just vote her out. They would never forgive her. The weeks leading up to the HOA election were like a storm slowly gathering on the horizon. On the surface, the community carried on with its usual routines. Lawns mowed, cars washed, neighbors waving across driveways. But beneath that veneer of normalcy, tension pulsed. Everyone knew the election wasn't just about choosing a board president. It was about deciding whether Karen's reign would continue or end. Karen, of course, treated it like a campaign. She went door to door, her smile painted on like armor, promising change and improvements. She spoke of revitalizing the community, lowering fees, and creating new amenities. The very same promises she had dangled for years. To anyone who questioned her about the failed lake project, she brushed it off with rehearsed excuses. Delays happen, she would say. It's all still moving forward. But her words no longer carried the weight they once did. Doubt had taken root. Meanwhile, I worked quietly. I didn't campaign in the traditional sense. Instead, I planted seeds of truth. When neighbors asked about fees, I pointed them toward the budget report. When whispers about corruption surfaced, I let slip that I had documentation. I never said too much, never overplayed my hand. Just enough to keep curiosity alive, just enough to make people wonder what Karen was hiding. The night of the election arrived, and the community hall buzzed with anticipation. Folding chairs filled the room, neighbors crowding in shoulder to shoulder. At the front sat the HOA board, with Karen perched in the center like a queen clinging to her throne. She wore her usual confidence like a mask, though the tightness around her eyes betrayed the strain. The meeting began with formalities, votes on minor agenda items, and brief reports. But everyone was waiting for the main event, the president's election. Karen stood, delivering a speech dripping with false humility and grand promises. She spoke of unity, of building a stronger future, of overcoming recent misunderstandings. The words were polished, the delivery smooth, but the energy in the room felt different. There were no cheers, no eager applause, just polite claps and skeptical glances. When she finished, the floor opened for comments. That was my moment. I rose slowly, the thick folder of evidence in my hand. The room quieted as I walked to the front, every eye following me. Karen stiffened, her smile faltering. She knew what was coming. I began calmly, laying out the facts. I reminded everyone of the ribbon-cutting fiasco, of how the community had been promised a lake project that never materialized. Then I revealed the documents. Deeds proving the lake was mine, financial records showing no budget was ever approved for her project. Gasps rippled through the room as I flipped through the spreadsheets, highlighting discrepancies in landscaping contracts, inflated invoices, and security patrol bills. Each page painted the same picture. Years of mismanagement, favoritism, and possible fraud. Karen tried to interrupt, claiming I was misrepresenting the numbers, but the board, once her allies, didn't back her this time. They leaned forward, eyes scanning the documents, realizing they had been complicit in her schemes without even knowing it. The neighbors erupted. Voices rose, demanding answers, asking where their money had gone. Questions about dues, about broken promises, about trust. The calm order of the meeting dissolved into chaos, a wave of anger directed squarely at Karen. Her son, sitting near the back, tried to defend her, shouting about lies and conspiracies, but his words only fueled the fury. People shouted him down, reminding him of his trespassing, his arrogance, the dock that still sat half-finished on land that didn't belong to him. Karen's mask cracked. Her voice grew shrill, her arguments desperate. She accused me of sabotaging her, of twisting the truth. But the evidence was too overwhelming, too precise. It wasn't my word against hers anymore. It was hard proof against years of deception. The board called for a vote of confidence on the spot. One by one, hands went up. Neighbors who had once supported her, now ready to see her gone. The tally was decisive. Karen had been stripped of her presidency, her power, her carefully constructed empire collapsing in a single night. As the gavel struck, sealing the vote, Karen sat frozen, her face pale and rigid. The room buzzed with relief, neighbors finally free from her iron grip. For the first time in years, people laughed and chatted without fear of fines or retaliation. A new chapter for the community had begun. But for me, it wasn't about celebration. It was about closure. It was about closure. I had protected my land, exposed corruption, and dismantled the reign of the woman who had tried to take everything from me. Yet as I walked out of the meeting hall, I couldn't shake the image of Karen sitting there, defeated but seething. I knew her type. She wouldn't go quietly. Even without the title, even without the power, she would find a way to strike back. The war might have been won, but the battle wasn't over. The night of the election was supposed to be the end. Karen had been dethroned, her power stripped, her credibility shattered in front of the very neighbor she once ruled. Most people thought that would be enough to silence her, to finally restore peace to the community. But people like Karen don't fade quietly. When power has been your lifeblood, losing it feels like death, and Karen wasn't ready to die. In the days after her removal, the neighborhood felt lighter. No more surprise inspections. No new fines piling up in mailboxes. People smiled again, chatted openly, even began planning small improvements for the community without fear of her interference. It was a fragile peace, and for a while it felt like the nightmare was truly over. But beneath that calm surface, Karen was plotting. It started with small provocations. Her son, once again emboldened, returned to the lake late at night with his friends. They blasted music, left beer bottles, and treated the place like their personal clubhouse. It was as though losing the HOA presidency had only deepened their sense of entitlement. I called the sheriff, and each time the trespassers were forced to leave, but they always came back, more brazen than before. Then one morning, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. Fresh construction materials had been dumped by the lake, lumber, nails, and cement bags. Someone had restarted the dock project without permission, and this time it wasn't just the son. Karen herself was down there, barking orders, her face twisted with determination. She claimed the election had been a sham, that she was still the rightful president, and that the lake was still a community property. It didn't matter that she had been voted out. It didn't matter that the deed was in my name. In her mind, none of it mattered. She was trying to seize control one last time, by force of will, if not by law. I didn't confront her right away. Instead, I called the authorities. When the sheriff's deputies arrived, they found Karen and her son knee-deep in stolen work. Karen raged, waving old HOA papers like they were legal documents, insisting she had authority. But the deputies didn't waver this time. They had seen the deed. They had heard the history. And now, with fresh evidence of trespass and property damage, they had no choice but to act. Karen was warned that if she stepped foot on my land again, she would face criminal charges. Her son was issued a citation for vandalism. The deputies made it clear this was the end of the road. But Karen didn't back down easily. She screamed at the officers, accused the entire neighborhood of conspiring against her, and hurled threats about lawsuits and revenge. Neighbors gathered at a distance, watching the scene unfold. For years, she had terrorized them with her authority. Now they saw her stripped bare, powerless and desperate, her empire reduced to shouting at deputies who no longer cared. The moment was cathartic. People who had once feared her now laughed open. Her son, red-faced and humiliated, tried to drag her away. But even he seemed exhausted by her delusions. When the deputies finally escorted her off my land, silence settled over the lake. The half-built dock stood abandoned, the last monument to her arrogance. I looked at the water, at the land my family had cherished for generations, and felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The lake was mine again, not because I had won it, but because I had defended it. In the weeks that followed, Karen vanished from community life. She skipped meetings, ignored calls, and kept to herself. Her house, once the hub of HOA power, grew quiet and unkempt. The queen had been dethroned, and without her crown, she had nothing. The HOA, freed from her grip, began to rebuild. Finances were made transparent, projects were approved fairly, and neighbors who had once been divided started working together again. The community, for the first time in years, felt like a place worth living in. As for me, I learned something important. Power doesn't always show itself in loud voices or grand gestures. Sometimes it hides in the details. The budgets, the records, the quiet patience to wait for the right moment. Karen thought she could take everything with intimidation and bluster. She never understood that true control isn't about fear. It's about knowing where the strings are and how to pull them. The lake remains mine, peaceful and undisturbed. On quiet mornings, I walk its edge and watch the water ripple, grateful that it survived Karen's grasp. The dock has long since been dismantled, the stakes pulled up, the trash cleared away. It's as though her intrusion was nothing more than a bad dream. But the lesson remains. Never underestimate someone who thinks they own the world, and never forget the power of patience. Don't. Because in the end, Karen didn't lose because I shouted louder. She lost because I was already holding the one thing she never cared about. The truth backed by proof and sealed in ink on the budget she never controlled. And that was what destroyed her.